Careful.
Thank you. Well, hello, everybody. This is Empowering Democracy. I'm your host, Joe Firestone. Welcome to another show. Our topic for tonight is the resistance has a plan. Israel has an illusion. Where did the illusions come from? In part, I think they come from the United States, but let us see what they're like. There was a recent very good article, by Alastair Crooke, a former UK diplomat who was taken to strategizing about international politics and who has very, very good thinking upon occasion, as I think he has in the article we're going to go over tonight. Steve Wolfbrand is here. Hello, Steve. It's good to see you here. I noticed you were at the 8 o'clock show also. Thank you very much. I'm going to present the article by Alastair Crooke. The article originally appeared at Strategic Culture, but if I use the Strategic Culture version and I link to it, then Facebook would not accept it, and I would have to shut down the stream. But if I take the same article, as it appears at LouRockwell.com, anti-state, anti-war, pro-market, which means it's probably a libertarian website. It's perfectly acceptable then to Facebook. At least I didn't get any gripes when I set it to stream to Facebook. So here we are. So, title of the article is not quite the same as the title of this stream. The resistance has a plan for Israel, but on the other side, fantastical U.S. stratagems ensure a cascading failure. This was done on February 21st, 2024. That's today. We have entered a period of breakdown and violence as the forces pulling apart the old status quo cascade and mutually reinforce one another. In a speech on Tuesday, Hezbollah leader Sayed Nasrallah, I think it's actually Hassan Sayed bin Nasrallah, said that the party will continue the border offensive until at least the Gaza massacre stops. The war in Gaza, however, is far from over. Let me expand the type on this article somewhat. No reason we have to have eye strain here. The war in Gaza, however, is far from over. And Nasrallah warned that even were a ceasefire to be reached in Gaza, quote, should the enemy perform any action, we will return to operating according to the rules and formulas that existed before. The purpose of the resistance is to deter the enemy and we will react accordingly, unquote. Israel's Defense Secretary Gallant, that is to say his name is Yoav Gallant, has underlined that contrary to international consensus expectations, he too expects the war in Lebanon to continue. Gallant said the military has stepped up its attacks on Hezbollah by one level out of 10. Quote, the Air Force planes flying currently in the skies of Lebanon have heavier bombs for more distant targets. Hezbollah went up half a step, whilst we a full one. We can attack not only at 20 kilometers from the border, but also at 50 kilometers and in Beirut. Okay, and anywhere else, unquote. It is not clear what, quote, red line, unquote, Hezbollah would have to cross for Israel to significantly escalate its response to much higher levels. Israeli leaders have suggested that an attack on a strategic site or an attack leading to major civilian casualties or substantive barrage on Haifa might constitute the breaking point. Nevertheless, with 3 military divisions rather than the usual one now deployed in the north of Israel, the IDF has more forces poised for action on the northern border than it has preparing for an incursion into Rafah at this point. It is clear, as Chief of Staff Halevi has specified, that Israel is, quote, preparing for war against Hezbollah more than preparing for Rafah. Is the threat to Rafah a bluff to put pressure on Hamas to concede on the deal and hostages? One way or another, both Israel's political and military chiefs are adamant the IDF will incurse into Rafah, quote, at some point, unquote. The qualitatively different Hezbollah strike on Safed on Israel's Northern Regional Command headquarters on Wednesday, which that resulted in 2 dead and 7 further casualties, is being treated in Israel as the gravest attack since the start of the war, with Ben-Gvir calling it a, quote, declaration of war, unquote. Subsequent Israeli attacks killed 11 people, including 6 children, in a barrage of strikes on villages across southern Lebanon in retribution for the Safed Blitz, with the fierce exchange of fire still continuing. The Safed strike deep into Galilee very likely was intended to signal that Hezbollah is not about to capitulate to Western demands that it provide Israel with a ceasefire that is intended to facilitate evacuated Israelis to return to their homes in the north, as Nasrallah confirmed in a scathing attack on those external Western mediators who serve only as Israel's lawyers and neglect to address the massacres in Gaza. Quote, it is easier to move the Litani River forward to the borders than to push back Hezbollah fighters from the borders to behind, the Litani River. They want us to pay a price without Israel committing to a thing, unquote. In these circumstances, Nasrallah clarified that residents of northern Israel will not return to their homes, warning that even more Israelis risk being displaced. Quote, Israel, unquote, must prepare shelters, basements, hotels, and schools to house 2 million settlers who will be evacuated from northern Palestine, were Israel to expand the war zone. Nasrallah outlined what is clearly the agreed axis of resistance's overarching plan. There has been a flurry of meetings between senior Axis principals over the last week across the region for which Nasrallah is speaking. Quote, we are committed to fighting Israel until it is off the map. A strong Israel is dangerous to Lebanon, but a deterred Israel, defeated and exhausted, is less of a danger to Lebanon. Quote, the national interest of Lebanon, the Palestinians, and the Arab world is that Israel leaves this battle defeated, Therefore, we are committed to Israel's defeat. Put bluntly, the Axis has its vision of the conflict's outcome, and it is a, quote, deterred, defeated, and exhausted, unquote, Israeli state. By implication, it is an Israel that has relinquished the Zionist project, one that is reconciled to the notion of living as Jews between the river and the sea, albeit with rights no different to others living there, i.e., Palestinians. On the other side, the Western strategic plan, as the Washington Post reports, which the U.S. and several Arab countries hope to present within a few weeks, is a long-term plan for peace between Israel and the Palestinians, including a time frame for the establishment of a provisional demilitarized Palestinian state, quote unquote. Imperatively, it begins with a hostage deal, which is accompanied by a 6-week ceasefire between Israel and Hamas. While it may be termed, quote, cessation of hostilities, sorry about that, folks. I need to do a little housekeeping here. While it may be termed, quote, cessation of hostilities, unquote, or, unquote, extended humanitarian pause, such a ceasefire will signal the de facto end of the war along the lines and scale that it has been fought since the 7th of October. The plan addresses, quote, post-war Gaza in terms already well known, as senior Israeli commentator Alon Pincus affirms. Quote, parallel to the announcement of U.S., Britain, and possibly other countries will consider and eventually make a joint statement of intent by recognizing a provisional, demilitarized, and future Palestinian state without actually delineating or specifying its borders, unquote. Such a recognition does not necessarily contradict Israel's legitimate and reasonable demand to have overriding security control over the area west of the Jordan River in the foreseeable future. It constitutes a practical, time-bound, irreversible path to a Palestinian state living side by side in peace with Israel, whose recognition could also be submitted to the UN Security Council as a binding resolution. Once the Arab countries sign off on such a framework, the U.S. believes that neither China nor Russia would veto it. Within the regionalization phase, however, the Americans will craft a regional security cooperation mechanism. Some in Washington imagine a reconfigured region with a new, quote, security architecture, unquote, as a harbinger to a gradual Mideast version of the European Union with greater economic and infrastructure integration, unquote. The article says, the new Middle East again. Even Alon Pincus, an experienced former Israeli diplomat, concedes, quote, if the plan seems too fantastical to you, you're not alone, unquote. The basic improbabilities to this plan simply are disregarded. First, Israel's finance minister Smotrich responded to the reported American Arab plan saying, quote, there's a joint American, Arab, British, and Arab effort to establish a terrorist state next to Israel. Second, this Smotrich further notes, quote, they see the polls. They see how the absolute majority of Israelis oppose this idea of a Palestinian state. And thirdly, some 700,000 settlers were installed in the West Bank precisely to block any Palestinian state. Is the U.S. really going to impose this on a hostile Israel? How? Hang on a second. I did not share this one to Facebook. And I really ought to do so before we end. Okay. So, and from the resistance perspective, quote, a provisional, demilitarized, and future Palestinian, quote, state, unquote, without delineated or specified borders is not a state. It is truly a Bantustan. Well, that refers to the fake states within the Union of South Africa at the time of apartheid. The reality is that when a Palestinian state might have been a real prospect 2 decades ago, the international community turned a willing, quote, blind eye, unquote, for decades to Israel's successful and complete sabotage of the project. Today, circumstances are much changed. Israel has moved far to the right and is in the grip of a eschatological passion. I guess it's an eschatological passion to establish Israel on the entire, quote, land of Israel.
Biden's going to cancer.
Bonnie,
Debt.
Bonnie.
Oh.
The international community turned a willing, quote, blind eye, unquote, for decades to Israel's successful and complete sabotage of the project. Today's circumstances are much changed. Israel has moved far to the right, is in the grip, okay, of an eschatological passion to establish Israel on the entire land of Israel. The U.S. and Europe have only themselves to blame, okay, for the dilemma in which they now find themselves. And a policy stance, such as outlined by Biden, plainly said, is doing untold strategic damage to the United States and its compliant European allies. Even on the Lebanon track, let us be plain too, Israel's demands from Lebanon go far beyond a mutual ceasefire. There is no guarantee, even should a ceasefire be reached in Gaza, as part of a comprehensive hostage end of war deal, that Nasrallah will agree to withdraw all his forces from the border with Israel, or conversely, that Israel will comply with its commitments. And with the U.S. defining its Palestinian solution, quote unquote, as an improbable, provisional, disarmed, and wholly impotent Palestinian entity nestled within a fully militarized Israel, exercising full security overlordship from the river to the sea, unquote, it would not be surprising were Hezbollah rather to opt to pursue the Axis plan of a defeated, exhausted post-Zionism. Israeli commentator Tzvi Bar-El writes, even with the American assumptions to become a working plan, it is still unclear what policy Israel will adopt on Lebanon, even pushing Hezbollah back so that Israeli communities are no longer within the range of its anti-tank missiles. does not remove the threat of tens of thousands of medium and long-range missiles. The difference equation between Israel and Hezbollah will continue to determine the true reality along the border. The current U.S. working assumption, as presented by the administration's special envoy, Amos Hochstein, in his previous visits to Lebanon, quote, is that a border demarcation agreement between Israel and Lebanon will result in final and full recognition of the international border and thus deny Hezbollah the formal basis for justifying its continued fight against Israel to liberate occupied Lebanese territories. At the same time, it allows the Lebanese government to order its army to deploy its forces along the border in order to assert its sovereignty over its entire territory and demand that Hezbollah forces pull back from the border. This is just more wishful, quote, fantastical, unquote, thinking, says Crooke, and it contains a flaw. Hochstein's work plan does not include an agreement on the Shebaa farms, but only on the blue line, quote unquote. The border agreed in 2000, but which is not recognized by Lebanon as an international border. If the issue of the Shebaa farms is not settled, Hezbollah will not be bound by a limited demarcation accord that omits the Shebaa area. Since Hamas's attack on Israel on 7th of October, every stratagem and protocol dug from some musty West Wing cupboard and upon which the U.S. lent has failed, but was supposed to be a limited and compartmentalized military operation in Gaza by the IDF has turned into a regional firestorm. Aircraft carriers sent to deter other actors from getting involved failed with the Houthis. U.S. bases in Iraq and Syria became targets, with attacks on U.S. bases continuing despite the U.S. attempts at delivering deterrent punches. Quite clearly, Netanyahu is ignoring Biden and, quote, defying the world, unquote, as this week's headlines attest. Quote, defying Biden, Netanyahu doubles down on plans to fight in Rafah, unquote. That's from the Wall Street Journal. And, quote, as Israel corners Rafah, Netanyahu defies the world, unquote, says the Washington Post. And, quote, U.S. won't punish Israel for Rafah op that doesn't protect civilians. But that's a Politico quote. And, quote, Egypt builds walled enclosure on border as Israeli offensive looms. Authorities are surrounding an area in the desert with concrete walls as a contingency for possible influx of Palestinian refugees. That's from the Wall Street Journal. But Netanyahu has vowed to forge ahead, saying on Wednesday that Israel would mount a, quote, powerful, unquote, operation in the city of Rafah once residents have been evacuated, quote, unquote. Israelis explicitly say the White House is not opposed to the Rafah blitz, provided Palestinians are given the opportunity to, quote, evacuate, unquote. To where is left unsaid. Meanwhile, Egypt is building a refugee camp inside its borders, surrounded by concrete walls. At this point, all of the U.S. various problems, the political polarization, widening war, funding for wars, the alienation amongst the swing state Arab constituencies, and Biden's sinking ratings are beginning to feed into and reinforce each other. What began as a foreign policy issue, Israel defeating Hamas, has become a significant domestic crisis. Dissatisfaction with the United States and Israel's conduct of the war is fueling the growth of significant protest movements. Who can truly believe that yet another trip by Blinken to the region will solve anything at this point, asks Malcolm Kayuni, It is hard to say where things in the region will stand a couple of months from now. We have entered a period of breakdown and violence as the forces pulling apart the old status quo cascade and mutually reinforce one another. Well, to me, that's a very, very interesting article showing the dynamics created by the need for Israel to have security in Gaza, for its need to control the West Bank, for its need to put off, the Egyptians, and of course, one of the primary needs right now, its need to defend its northern borders against an increasingly powerful Hezbollah, prepared in case of war to dump thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of missiles and rockets and drones, on Israel. So that is what we are looking at here. And I don't think there's much that Israel can do about that. I don't even think the war in Lebanon was a good thing to do. I think it's basically destructive and suicidal. And I hope that Israel thinks better of it. I will now look at your comments. Lisa says, hi, Joe. Hi, Steve. Hi, Lisa. Yes, this was my 8:30 show, Lisa. I also had an 8 o'clock show. And I had a 5:15 show, actually, as well. By the way, you may be interested in my 5:15 show because that was my answer to Rabbi Shmuley. I did my best to take down Rabbi Shmuley relatively quickly and easily in that show. It's about a half hour. It may be a little longer. But that's the one you may be more interested in than these other two, though I think these are very interesting also. Anyway, it's 8:57, unless there are some comments here which are very pregnant in various ways. I have to go because I'm pretty sure Dee is having a show at 9 or so p.m. And I'm committed to join the Around the World with Dee and Friends shows at that time, provided she has a link for me to use. I think she does. So, are you covering Assange Day X? Yes, I think I am. I think I will be covering Assange Day X in some way. I don't know exactly what I will do because I certainly won't be on the spot for it. But I'm certainly very concerned about it, as I think we all are, because it's a tremendous blow to the First Amendment if they finally get him. And it's important that at this point he go back to Australia and the government simply leaves off. It is totally in the wrong on this. And it just has to break off now. But if it doesn't break off, the remedy is the same. It's the same, Steve. The remedy is dump the corruption. I think you know that. Until we replace the guts of this political system in the Congress, okay, and the executive branch, a guts that is doing the bidding, okay, of big money. We're not going to get any good stuff done. I don't think Assange would have been subject to any of this if we had had a dump the corruption movement back then, and if it had taken hold, okay, of Congress. Well, it's 9 p.m. and I must be going. I encourage you both to visit Around the World with Dee and Friends. I'll be there in just a minute. I suspect Madeline is also there tonight, but I don't know that for sure. But it's often the three of us. So I'm going to say good night. I'll see you tomorrow with some Dump the Corruption shows. And I may do one or two foreign policy shows, including one dealing with Assange very soon now. But there'll be 6 more shows this week. So actually 7 if you include, well, I'm not including any of my appearances with Dee, so they have to be added. Thanks for coming. It's great to see you both here at once. So I'm going.